This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
First of all, welcome to everybody. My name is Laurence, for those of you I've not met before, a fellow here at the IGRS, and welcome to the first of these seminars. To have put any text of Hegel's into people's laps as an opening for a seminar is a dangerous thing to do, because Hegel is not easy, but to take a small section from the end of the Logik and throw it at you and expect you to want to realise what's going on must have been quite perplexing. So I'm hoping that the introduction will make clear why this particular section is important. Today's will be perhaps the most abstract of all the sessions. If you get the abstraction, if we can get the abstraction, because this is the work for all of us, into focus at the beginning of this, then the rest of it, I think, will fall out. And that's, in my experience, the way to read Hegel, because it's the way he himself thinks. So it brings us into alignment with him. Does anybody need copies of the text? Because I have some spares. Yeah. So there's the English and the German. Precisely because today is so abstract, I've deliberately chosen a very short text. The headline title for these seminars is a provocation. The thought of private property, the family and the state is more properly thought of as the title of a book by Engels, in which Engels claims to be following faithfully the thought of Karl Marx. I think, for what it's worth, my own view is that he is faithfully following the thought of Karl Marx. But those of you familiar with Marx studies these days will know that Engels is the bad boy of Marxism, from whom all evils flow, including Stalinism, and Marx is the goody. I repudiate and reject this story because I think it's a fiction designed to make it easier for Americans to read Marx. But anyway, you can take all of that as a discussion for the pub afterwards. The provocation, however, is this. The matter of thought of Engels, the thought of Marx, indeed the political thought of the last 2 centuries, almost exactly, in the West and as a whole, is unthinkable without the thought of Hegel. And that's my headline for these whole seminars. After long neglect, we are witnessing a certain return to Hegel's thought. And yet this return is tentative, perhaps even faltering. Rather, too often, even now, Hegel's thinking is treated as an episode in the history of ideas. Anybody who was at the Cambridge Conference on Idealism last summer will know this. You know, these people were talking about Hegel as if he was an object in a museum display cabinet, rather, therefore, than the unfolding of our very being. I think it's certainly for me difficult to get away from the thought that Hegel continues to explain to us who we actually are now, whether we like it or not. In this we think entirely unphilosophically, when we settle for thinking through Hegel's work merely historiographically, as one body of theory or philosophy among others, one from which we can take our pick of what we like or dislike and fashion it to our needs. Hegel, above all, is the thinker at one and the same time of the universal and the particular. He demands that we address him philosophically, and that means in the full measure of his thinking. We address him, therefore, as he addresses us, by turning towards and thinking through what it is he thinks of. For me, that is the transition from a merely historiographical thinking about somebody. What did they write? What did they say? To ask myself the question, in what I think, to what extent am I capable of thinking of what they think of? You see the point? We're no longer just thinking about Hegel, you know, in a certain style of scholarship that says, well, what did he do on the afternoon of 1806? You know, which cornflake packet did he eat from that morning? But rather, in that he is attempting to think both the whole of all that is to be thought and his own particularity within it, to what extent am I capable of thinking alongside and together with what he thinks of? Thinking through what Hegel thinks of requires that we ourselves think through who we ourselves are, from whence we stem, whither we are set. To think on a scale any less than this is not to be capable of what Hegel thinks of. We must therefore, to a certain extent, reach up to think with the breadth and depth to which Hegel's thought enjoins us, even if we're going to disagree with him. We may well do that. We may well want to do that. And yet, the question also arises, whose or what Hegel is at issue? There are quite a number around, actually. Are we investigating the Hegel, for instance, of Alexandre Kojève, of Jean Hippolyte, or perhaps of Karl Marx's grudging antipathy to Hegel? These interpreters of Hegel set out a whole way of thinking through Hegel's texts, even as they never managed to think beyond the horizon that Hegel laid out for them. Do we search out a very British, non-metaphysical Hegel? Do we find Hegel wanting a standard voice both of and for a patriarchy needing to be undone or overcome, as more than one feminist commentator has claimed? And that's particularly important, I think, for these seminars, which are going to think through issues of gender and issues of the family. Or on the contrary, are we to find and read in Hegel a fulfillment, an end, or a consummation, whose denouement is yet fully to come? The claim, for instance, of Martin Heidegger, almost from the outset of his commentary on Hegel and his thought. And yet this Heidegger reversed his view of Hegel at a most decisive moment, not only in his own life, but in history itself, especially the history of the West, and argued against Carl Schmitt that on the day that Adolf Hitler assumed power in Germany in 1933, on that very day, Hegel did not die, but in fact had only just begun to live. Now that was, if you know Schmitt's claim about Hegel, Schmitt famously said in a short monograph a few months after Hitler's accession to power that on that day Hegel died. And that was the standard claim that Hegel was the author of communism and that Karl Marx was following in Hegel's wake. And Heidegger, having resigned from the rectorate in 1934 of Freiburg University as the so-called first Nazi rector of a German university, then opened some seminars on Hegel by claiming that, on the contrary, that everybody knew Schmitt's quote, it was all over Germany at the time. On the contrary, on the day that Hegel was supposed to have died, that was the day that he lived. And Heidegger, therefore, is identifying in Hegel a tendency towards totalitarianism, as he understood it. You now see the juxtaposition. Will we be capable of interpreting Hegel for ourselves? And if so, to what end? Or do we have to follow in the footsteps of others? And so with what consequences? These are good questions, I think, to put before yourself, studying anybody, let alone Hegel. Hegel's corpus is large and difficult, spread across 30 years or more in its most important texts. Frequently revised, there are, for instance, no less than 3 versions of the Logik, albeit that the last was incomplete in view of Hegel's death. Yet Hegel, the highest and most consummate metaphysician, who thinks, we might want to say, the final form of metaphysical thought, at the same time subordinates all experience, all life, to what he most decisively calls reason, Vernunft. The magnificence of Hegel's reach represents, therefore, a decisive limitation, an establishment of the limits of thought itself. Almost everything that has flowed in thought about property, the family, and the state after Hegel has done so either consciously or unconsciously accepting the limitations Hegel laid down, even where those limits have been found to be deficient. Overgirding, stifling at times, they have been challenged and overturned within the boundaries the limitations themselves have set. At the same time, and all too often, the limitations claimed for Hegel are not his own, but are a mark of the degree to which even contemporary understanding has fallen short of what Hegel's work is capable of thinking through. It is routinely claimed, for instance, that Hegel equates, and I quote, women and nature as forces opposed to the state. Or that Hegel maps the opposition between the family and the state onto differences between the sexes. Claims that we will see over the coming weeks and even today are impossible to sustain. Terry Pinkard opens his impressive biography of Hegel with a paragraph of assumptions about his subject. Pinkard says that he is, and I quote, one of those thinkers just about all educated people think they know something about, end of quote. And then he goes on to comment on Hegel's idealism in contrast to Marx's materialism, on Hegel's glorification of the Prussian state, and the part that Hegel played in the growth of German nationalism, authoritarianism, and militarism, and Hegel's pretentious mysticism of the absolute. And Pinkard concludes, just about everything here is false, except for the first sentence. The first sentence being that Hegel is one of those thinkers just about all educated people think they know something about. In having the texts of Hegel before us, then, what is it that we have? And this is a really important question. We have become accustomed, especially with contemporary authors, to having the text of whatever it is that we are studying. The text comes to us in a form decided or laid down by the author, and from which we set out. Modern books are just like this. They're edited, they're prepared, they're indexed. Well, unless you're unlucky. But more and more books aren't indexed these days. It's very frustrating. Even when the author publishes her or his work with the assistance of editors or after the commentary of peers, nevertheless there is a sense in which the author has decided and confirmed what she or he puts before us. Every word is a matter of his or her assent. Not so are the texts of Hegel. While indeed some of his works are directly at his hand, others, often the most important, have been amplified by editors, often appointed by him or who could lay claim to the right to compile and add texts from other sources. At the same time, Hegel wrote under censorship. This did not mean that Hegel was censored, rather that he censored himself. It's a really important point. In order to evade censorship by others. Neither the Encyclopedia nor the Rechts Philosophie would be intelligible without the Zusätze, the additions of, for instance, Carl Ludwig Michelet or Edward Ganz and others, compiled from a variety of sources, student notes, Hegel's own notebooks and letters, and edited, therefore, with a far freer hand than would now be acceptable in a so-called critical edition. The lectures on aesthetics, on the philosophy of religion, the philosophy of history, and the history of philosophy are really nothing other than compilations. Nicolai and Pegler, writing in their edition of the Introduction to the Encyclopedia, complain that the compilers of the editions were only interested in their own philosophical position, and, and I quote, brought to their task no interest in the development of Hegel's thought. This in itself is an interpretation springing from the age out of which Nicolai and Pegler themselves wrote. That every thinker unquestionably develops and must be analysed in terms of his or her periodization or process of transformation is one of the extreme ways in which commentators have got to grip with thinkers in recent years. You know, lots of PhD theses have been milled out of this approach. Perhaps you're working on one of them, I think. And so reduce thinkers to the level of mere objects of analysis in the name of scholarship. What is extraordinary about Hegel, who did in some cases revise or rewrite texts, I've already mentioned that there were 3 editions of the Logik. What is extraordinary about Hegel is the extent to which, especially in the matter of marriage and the family, he remains consistent across a broad range of texts and across the years. It could safely be argued that from the Jenaer period onwards, in other words from about 1802 onwards, I think Hegel arrived in Jena in 1797, if I remember right, Hegel's fundamental metaphysical orientation does not change, and is the place from out of which his most fundamental thinking is worked out. We begin, therefore, not by asserting that we are ready to delimit Hegel's origination of property, the family, and the state, but rather that we will enter into this origination as a question, a question whose answer is yet to be found. A question concerning what or who. How are we going to ask this question in the coming weeks? Hegel's understanding of the place of the family as the origination of property and the state is a resolution of questions that persist in the very ground of his thought. The resolution of the relation of the particular to the universal, which I've already alluded to. For this thought is philosophical precisely in that it encompasses the thinking of not merely the particular in its particularity, nor the universal in its universality, but by what means and how the particular and the universal can be thought through together and as a whole. It is here that we can locate the how of Hegel's thought, but in a way that has often been rendered invisible precisely because of the particular polemic of one of his most celebrated disciples, namely, I think, Karl Marx. For Marx derides Hegel as being a mere idealist, in contrast to Marx's thoroughgoing materialism. In reality, however, Hegel's thought, and especially his thinking through the question of the family, property, and the state, is precisely the area of Hegel's most extreme materialism. Now, this is one of the claims that I intend to show in the coming seminars. We have to read Hegel as a materialist, as it were, almost before we read him as an idealist. And the two things are not necessarily opposed in the way that Marx suggested that they were. And we're dealing with a whole range of prejudices there, by the way. You know, not merely Karl Marx's, but also the prejudices of English philosophy. You know, I remember as a philosophy undergraduate in Oxford, asking my tutor what the connection was between Plato and Hegel. And he said, oh, there isn't one. Because Plato was a realist and Hegel was an idealist. Go figure. While we will begin our reading at the very end of Hegel's thinking with the Logik, we will in fact concentrate in future weeks on how Hegel came to formulate this question through the intense materialism of his lectures in the Jena period. The essence of Hegel's materialism resides, however, in his grasping of nature, der Natur, as a whole. It is only in the grasping of nature as a whole, as at one and the same time something entirely determinate and something universal, that he can overcome the tendency he perceives for humanity to settle for merely finite determinations as a consequence of this grasp, as opposed to the infinite grasp of pure Geist or spirit. You'll be familiar that Geist is, with the fact that Geist is almost impossible to translate. It means a whole range of things, and I'm therefore just not going to bother to translate it. We happily debate its translation and discussion, and that may be a good thing for us to do, but it's pointless. I'll confess my own prejudice. I detest the translation of mind for Geist, because it's a severe limitation. And there is, of course, a good old English word for this, which is ghostly. You know, you'll find it in the Book of Common Prayer. You know, the clergy of the Anglican Church are enjoined to ghostly counsel. It's exactly geistly counsel of the people in their cure. Grasp in this sentence is nothing other in this case than the notion of grasp over all. What is otherwise translated as the absolute concept or notion. This word notion is very favoured by the English translators. Those of you who are familiar with German will know this notion of grasp as der Begriff. What this means we shall see in due course. The opening sections of the second volume of the Encyclopedia, the Naturphilosophie, before they treat of the specificities of the natural sciences, or what Hegel goes on to call physics, are aimed at understanding the relation of humanity to nature as a whole. At the opening of the second volume of the Encyclopedia, in one of Michelet's Zusätze, we find the following. Die Not und der Witz des Menschen hat unendlich mannigfaltige Weisen der Veränderung und Bemeisterung der Natur erfunden. Sophokles sagt so, Uden anthropon deinoteron pele, aporos ep uden erchete. And I translate, the need and wit of man himself has proved infinite manifold ways for the expanding and mastering of nature. As Sophocles said, none more formidable than man. He meets nothing without resources. The Greek is from among the best-known lines of Sophocles' play Antigone, when the chorus speaks after the ruler Creon has learned of the burial of Polynicos against Creon's decree. Sophocles' Antigone, as much as in our own day, was of huge significance in the birth of German idealism. Repeatedly cited by or appealed to by Hegel, but through a decisive interpretation. If ordinarily Hegel is to be understood as interpreting Antigone as examining the conflict between the family and the state, and you'll now see why Antigone is important for these seminars, in fact what Hegel is engaged in is something at once wider and perhaps finally more banal. The question turns to some extent on the translation of the term Todenos. The Zusatz speaks immediately of the cunning of man's reason as die List seiner Vernunft. List is indeed an adequate dictionary-level translation of Denos, most cunning and nimble, we might say, Denoteron. Michelet's Zusatz concentrates on the practical relation to nature as a whole, and the extent and limited extent to which nature can be brought under the purposes of the human being, the anthropos. The Zusatz makes the point that the whole of nature is not brought under mastery simply by human cunning. Aber der Natur selbst des Allgemeinen kann den Mensch auf diese Weise nicht sich bemeistern, noch es zu seinen Zwecken abrichten. But nature herself, from her universality, man cannot himself master in this manner, nor bend to his purposes. The issue is not can never, but in this manner. Something else is already, and at the most universal level, capable of bringing nature under not a determinate, but an absolute mastery, as something which humanity itself already is, and absolutely is. The purposes of humanity themselves, humanity in its particularities, stand within and under the purposive character of nature as a whole, nature in general. You see the point that's being made here? You know, we try and take over nature by means of going up and grasping something external to ourselves. But in fact, this very going out and grasping is something which nature as a whole exhibits for itself, and under which we already stand. The Zusatz to section 245 of the Naturphilosophie notes that, and I quote, diesen Begriff des Zwecks hat auch Aristoteles schon in der Natur erkannt, und diese Wirksamkeit nennt die Natur eines Dinges. Die Natur eines Dinges. The concept of the purpose in nature was already recognized by Aristotle, and he named this effectivity the nature of a thing. The reality of something is something both realized, that is wirken, and is the effect, Wirkung, and capacity for effectiveness, Wirksamkeit, of its nature. What Hegel is driving toward here is that man experiences his drive and effectiveness, his capacity for mastery, Bemeisterung, as an exteriorization, Äußerung, Entäußerung. You'll be familiar with these words, I hope. But in fact, humanity needs to uncover its interiority to nature as a whole, for itself. The taking over and accomplishing of this interiorization as a mastering of the whole of nature is itself the absolutization of nature, its full completion and realization. The Zusatz of Michelet concludes, we assume, by the way, that these are Hegel's own words, we just don't know exactly where they've come from. The Zusatz concludes, die wahre theologische Betrachtung, und diese ist die höchste, besteht also darin, die Natur als frei in ihrer eigentümlichen Lebendigkeit zu betrachten. The true theological viewpoint, and this is the highest, consists thus in this: nature as itself, seen as free in its proper liveliness. Lebendigkeit is difficult to translate. I've translated it as liveliness. The two English translations of this text both have animation. The end of the purposiveness of nature as itself the purposive, as animation and activity in and for itself, is proper freedom. Put another way, something is properly free when it has fulfilled and brought to fulfillment its proper interior nature. Now, this, by the way, is an entirely Aristotelian thought. You know, Martin Heidegger has a really rather nasty aside about Hegel in his lectures on Hegel. He says that the Naturphilosophy is almost a paraphrase of Aristotle's physics. It's meant as a put-down. But there's an element of truth in it. That Hegel, quite self-consciously, doesn't intend to go beyond Aristotle, whilst at the same time wanting to bring Aristotle within the terms of a metaphysics of subjectivity. At the very heart of this realization of freedom is this being seen, Betrachtung, which is a difficult verb to translate into English. The Betrachtung in question is what subjectivity itself completes and brings to fulfillment in its contemplation of nature. This is not an external observing, but rather the accomplishment of a self-observation, of bringing the whole of nature as itself the purposive into subjective self-reflection. The end, the goal or purpose of which is freedom itself for Hegel. Thus, freedom and the possibility of its accomplishment is grounded in the very location of particularity with respect to the universal. By the way, this is, in political terms, which we will come to see, this is where Hegel has Rousseau most in his sights. It is for this reason that freedom is not realized in mere mastery, the mere overtaking of and laying hands on nature, either in its particularity or its general effects. Rather, the overtaking of nature as a whole from within, becoming subject to its universality, and I intend upon that, is itself the grasping Begrifflichkeit, not of nature as a whole, but of the totality of freedom. The specific determination of individual natures exhibit necessity. Each determinate nature has a specificity which is its course and which is necessary to it, a regularity, literally a conforming to lawfulness, a finitude, and a contingency. It appears and it passes away under the specific conditions of its lawfulness. The idea of freedom does not, therefore, arise on the basis of specific or determinate natures, but rather its apparent contrary, unswerving necessity. At the same time, the matter of laws, forces, species, Kräfte, Gesetze, Gattungen, manifest themselves as externalities. Throughout the rest of the introduction to the Naturphilosophie, Hegel seeks to explain the relation of necessity to freedom. You know, I mean, any physicist picking this book was intended for students who were students of natural philosophy or physics. Any student picking this book up or going to these lectures would not, think of it now in modern terms, if you sent engineers to lectures on engineering, they would be astonished to begin with a lecture on the relationship of necessity to freedom. That's how Hegel began his lectures to students who were going to be studying what we would call physics. We should recall here, but can only recall in the most cursory manner, that this question of the relation of freedom and necessity preoccupied Kant right up until the end, and he was unable to resolve it. You'll remember, it's one of the key questions of the opus postulum. Indeed, for Kant, the whole distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal, which Hegel constantly seeks to and believes himself to overcome, rests on the distinction between freedom and necessity. Thus, the introduction to the Naturphilosophie concerns itself with what it refers to as the Begriff der Natur. And there's no, by the way, there's no definite article. It just says Begriff der Natur. The English translations all add in the definite article. It's one of the few examples of where English seems to need to supply something that ordinarily you would find in German. You know, it should have, when you're translating, if any of you ever, and some of you may already be translators, You know, if something's missing, it's normally missing, especially in a language that normally overuses it compared to English. It's normally missing for a reason. Why the English translators all helped Hegel out with the addition of something, it's Begriff der Natur. There's no just grasp of nature. At once the concept of nature and the grasp of nature as a whole. Already we have moved beyond mere nature, and the very naming of any grasp, Begriff, brings us up against what, and this means who grasps, who conceives and thinks nature as a whole. The English translations, which insist, as I've already mentioned, on referring to Begriff as the notion, including in the English the idea as such is precisely what is at issue here, since nature as a whole is itself an abstraction, the effect of Betrachtung, a certain being seen or contemplation. The idea manifests itself as such and in specific circumstances as nature as a whole. In this form, Hegel says, die Natur hat sich als die Idee in der Form des Andersseins ergeben. Nature itself has yielded itself as the idea in the form of being other, or the other of being, depending on how you want to translate Andersseins. It is what follows that is really essential to understanding how Hegel realizes both nature and the idea, and the relation in which they stand. Nature presents itself as being other, moreover, as being other as such. Da die Idee so als das Negative ihrer selbst oder sich äußerlich ist, so ist die Natur nicht äußerlich nur relativ gegen diesen Idee und gegen die subjektive Existenz derselben, den Geist, sondern die Äußerlichkeit macht die Bestimmung aus, in welcher sie Natur ist. Here the idea, as much as it is the negative of itself, or is itself exterior, so nature itself is not only external relative to this idea, and so to the subjective existence of the same, Geist, but expresses the determination of exteriority in which, as nature, it is. In other words, that there is something exterior to us helps us understand exteriority as such. Hegel reiterates that nature in its actual existence, Dasein, exhibits no freedom but necessity and contingency, Notwendigkeit und Zufälligkeit. It is when we have understood all of this that we can understand what Hegel has in mind. For this within which subjectivity takes over and grasps exteriority, is not a single moment, a momentary grasp of the situation. On the contrary, die Natur ist als ein System von Stufen zu betrachten, deren einer aus der anderen notwendig hervorgeht. Nature itself is regarded as a system of stages, the one coming forth from the other. Here Hegel says something remarkable and surprising, which at the same time explains why I have chosen to concentrate on the Naturphilosophie to explain what is at issue. For Hegel says that this necessity of progression does not pertain naturally to the steps themselves, but rather only within that which constitutes the inner ground of the external expression, namely the idea. You can hear, to some extent, he's taking on Hume here. What secures and undergoes the metamorphosis of these otherwise indifferent alterations is the grasp itself, the concept, which constitutes the ground. This grasp is der dialektische Begriff, the dialectical grasp. What Hegel lays out in the Naturphilosophie with difficult density and compactness is the structure of the dialectic in its realization both of and through materiality. It is this that is often missed with the truncated attempts to explain Hegel's thought in the terms which he himself never employed of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And it's one of those things that dogs Hegel's studies. It's so easy as a teacher of Hegel to say, you know, Hegel himself taught. He never used these words. Others used them for him because it made it accessible to students. In the brief habilitation thesis that launched and made possible Hegel's philosophical career at Jena, we find the following sentence. I had to make do with an English translation here. I can't find the Latin. Well, the Latin's in the British Library. My British Library card expired about 2 weeks before, and I haven't got around to renewing it. So this is the English. For our pursuit of the laws of nature and our knowledge of them is founded on nothing other than the belief that nature is shaped by reason, and that we are convinced of the identity of all natural laws. Now, this is an extraordinary statement compared to a modern statement would say that reason is shaped by nature. Nature is shaped by reason. Materiality, therefore, is understood in consequence of reason, and not the other way around. This is the postulate which is in consequence of the fundamental thought of Kant, and indeed of Descartes, which Hegel is seeking to transform, that the I think is the unity and possibility, that which goes in advance of every thought of anything else. It is for this reason that we begin with Hegel's understanding of logic, and indeed with the text from the Logic itself, that we're going to look at in the second half. Hegel's concern in reorienting the particular to an immanence to the universal is to show how the rational is at each stage of the processes of the natural, the realization of the universal in its material form. Logic is never merely an operation among abstractions, as I was taught it. I don't know if any of you had a conventional English training in philosophy, that's exactly how you would have been taught it. It was horrific. Yeah, it was for me anyway. Rather, it is the means by which material forms indicate that ideal meaning, which is to say, the meaning of the idea. In the opening of the Logic of the Encyclopedia, Hegel argues in section 2, wenn es aber richtig ist, und es wird wohl richtig sein, dass der Mensch durchs Denken sich vom Tier unterscheidet, so ist alles Menschliche dadurch und allein dadurch menschlich, dass es durch das Denken bewirkt wird. If, however, it is correct, and it should indeed be correct, that man distinguishes himself through thinking from the animals, then everything human is thereby human alone, in that it is the result of thinking. You find an almost parallel opening in the opening of the first set of Jena lectures, where he begins with the life of the animal, and then the distinction. He traces the distinction between the animal and the human being, not in knowing things. The animal knows something as the human knows something, but only the human knows that it knows something. It's the fundamental distinction of reflection. That's what he defines as reflexion itself. The question here, however, is the question that besets Hegel's thought all the way through. Which I is it that constitutes the I of I think? Is it the absolute I of absolute subjectivity? Or is it this I here, my I, who I am? Hegel resolves this through the subjectival character of the whole of his thinking. Every I, including the I that I am, is in some sense at one and the same time the absolute I of absolute subjectivity. The point here, therefore, is that these steps are not, strictly speaking, a progression. They are the steps into coming to understand something which is already there. They're not constructive, except in the experience of consciousness. It's quite an important point to grasp. Thus, in the second of the Jenaer systematic sketches, we find under the title of The Realization of the Subject as Singular, Hegel arguing, das Subjekt als dieses unendlich Bestimmte, was auch das Individuelle genannt wird, tritt hier nicht bloß in Wirklichkeit auf, sondern das wirkliche Selbst des Allgemeines. Das Wirkliche als dieses ist die negative Einheit. The subject, as this infinitely determined, which is also called the individual, emerges not merely into reality here, Rather, the actual itself emerges as universal. The actual, as this, is negative unity itself. I'm not sure which is clearer, the English or the German. This ambiguity, or our surmounting of it, returns us again to the question of whether the I is a grasping of the exteriority of the world, or whether the I, as immanent to the universal, is itself the immanent being grasped of world. Now, this is an ambiguity that runs all the way through Hegel's thinking. You know, which way is this? It's all of Hegel's thought is circular. Which way is the circle turning? Such that the I lets the world be seen. The I does not operate on the world by means of reason, but rather is the occasion for the appearance of the operations, the logic of reason itself. However, this letting be seen always leads us back up to the point at which reason as mere cognition must relearn itself all over again. The culmination and end of logic is both the point at which cognition begins and the beginning of cognition is itself the ground or origination of the possibility of logic. So later, Hegel both, and you'll notice therefore, by the way, that the section that we're not going to consider, we're right at the end of the logic in the text I gave you. You'll notice the next section is cognition itself. And it's not accidental. And yet, surely one would say cognition is at the beginning of logic, not the end. But it's a circular book. So later, Hegel both defines and concludes the meaning of logic itself, and he argues in the same exposition at the opening to the discussion on metaphysics. This is the second of the inner sketches. Logik hört da auf, wo das Verhältnis aufhört und seine Glieder als für sich sehende auseinanderfallen, indem das Erkennen als die Reflexion in sich selbst sein erstes Moment wird. Logic comes to an end, where relationship comes to an end, and its members fall asunder as being for itself. For cognition, as reflection within itself, comes to be its own moment. Now, again, we have a problem, you know, in the English translation. It says that it's für sich Sehende. It's für sich Seiende, you would say. This is the only edition I have is the one with the Schwäbian dialect use of the verb sein. It's singular, and yet the English translations all turn this being into beings. It's a problem. Logic is both relationship and its overcoming in the purely simple, cognition, self-contemplation as such. You will note that our text today is the conclusion of the logical discussion of the logic, and takes us up to the point where the section on cognition begins. This beginning where we end is in a sense the reproductive moment of Hegel's thought. However, we do not secure Hegel's thought nor grasp it as a process of reproduction, but rather as that wherein the thought of reproduction is both thought and shown to have been materialized. This is our concern with the origins of the family, property, and the state. As we shall come to see, reproduction itself is the ground of production, and not the other way around. At the center of Hegel's account of the family in the Rechts philosophy is an essentially ahistorical account of reproduction, which we will look at in detail, which has the effect of functioning as the engine of the production and reproduction of the civil society in which the social and economic relations have their specific historical, concrete, and material form. The family is in this sense the most material expression of Hegel's dialectical logic. It is the means by which history itself is both produced and reproduced. Hegel argues that, and I quote, the family completes itself in three respects, or the three respects. In the form of its immediate concept as union, which then proceeds to its exterior existence through property and wealth, and completes itself in the upbringing of children and its dissolution, the dissolution of the family, which prompts the return to the possibility of further union and the recapitulation of the cycle all over again. The word I have translated as respects is in German Seite, sides, normally indicating one side or the other, but there are three. The third side is the return to the first. The essential motion described is therefore circular and occurs as repetition over time. As this repetition, it is itself the production of history. The production of children provides for the completion and the dissolution of the family. The family which has proceeded beyond the particular individual results in the production of a new individual or set of individuals, children, at which point the producing family itself is free to pass away. This in turn presupposes the dialectical reproduction of the process. The movement from immediate concept to its negation, and the negation of that negation in the stages of material existence, and final resolution and possibility of a condition for repetition, a sublation of what went before. This, Hegel argues, is the liveliness in its totality, namely of the reality of the species, Gattung, and its process. That's from the Rechtsphilosophie. Die Lebendigkeit in ihrer Totalität, nämlich als Wirklichkeit der Gattung und deren Prozess. In fact, this brief account, which as we shall examine when we come to study the Rechtsphilosophy, only alludes to the dialectical process, and is fully explained in the late section of the Wissenschaft der Logik, which I have asked you to prepare. We read from the chapter on the idea in a section entitled Life. Hegel introduces the discussion by explaining the connection of life with truth through cognition. Hegel recapitulates the essential thought of the entire logic. Because the idea itself is true, or anything is true only insofar as it is idea, being, he says, has attained the significance of truth, inasmuch as the idea is the unity of the concept and reality. Sein hat die Bedeutung der Wahrheit erreicht, indem die Idee die Einheit des Begriffs und der Realität ist. Hegel's relentless materialism should not be overlooked. The idea is not merely the concept, and above all is nothing abstract, but rather is itself both manifest and known only through its realities, its materializations. At the same time, it is the material and real which makes knowing itself actual, and which brings it about as the knowledge that it is. At the same time that Hegel's philosophy is a materialism, it is a philosophy of subjectivity. Hegel adds, in nature itself, life appears as the highest stage, which it attains to through its exteriority, an exteriority which in itself passes away, such that it is sublated into subjectivity. What Hegel describes here is the means by which, through exterior and material forms, but also in their overcoming or sublation and dying away, absolute knowing, truth, comes to be and unfolds. Everything that follows in this section of the logic is to be understood as the working out of the philosophy of subjectivity. It is from this that Hegel begins with the idea of life in its immediacy, as yet only the creative universal soul. Die Idee des Lebens in ihrer Unmittelbarkeit ist nur erst die schöpferisch allgemeine Seele. What is worked out in its specificities in the Rechtsphilosophie, the relation of the family to civil society and the state, with constant references to the terms of the logic, is explained as a dialectical movement in the logic itself, and thus as a syllogism. Hegel explains the dialectical movement of life in three moments, paralleling the three sides of the organic process of the family. First, that of a living individual that is for itself a subjective totality. Second, the life process itself of sublating its presupposition, aufzuheben, and through the negative objectivity which it comes up against and to which it stands opposed, actualizing itself as the power and negative unity of the negation that this objective posits to it. And thirdly, he says, is the process of the genus, its isolation, and in this, its isolation is overcome. And as its objective existence, it relates itself to itself, it completes itself. As Hegel later says, by relating its particularity to the universality of genus as such, Gattung. The first premise of the syllogism is the purposiveness in which the concept attains to the objectivity of a purposive living organism as external and part of a manifold of members. It is in this manifold that Hegel explains the self-interest of particularity alongside the impulse to mutual interest. In individuality, we find, and he says, a drive of each singular specific moment to produce itself and at the same time to uplift its particularity to universality, to cancel the others external to it, to propagate itself at their expense, but at the very same, to cancel itself and make itself a means for the others. This is the moment described in the Logik, in the Rechts, and again in the Rechts philosophy, of the family discovering its unity through the propagation of children. When the individual exceeds him or herself and abandons self-interest for the sake of the interest of others, then the syllogism unfolds. The mediation of civil society converts the self-interests of the production of resources, Vermögen, or capital, into the administration and stewardship of resources for all. It is for this reason that civil society is only the means to the production of the actual existence of the state, in which the universality of the species takes its public form. What is this moment? It is the moment of production itself, reproduction as production. Hegel says it is the moment of production, of the reflection of the species in itself, the propagation of the living genus, such that Gattung, species, is Begattung, copulation. I'm going to end there, because I think I've said everything I want to say in opening. I'm going to suggest we take a 10-minute break and then come back and look at the text itself, to try and flesh out some of the things that I've said. Thank you. So if we could be 25-2, if we start strictly at 25-2.
No, I'm not going to help you. Why should you go? American, you know, just all this small, these things, and the whole lot of sugar, brown or white, doesn't matter.
I'd like to know whether he agrees with Hegel's very positive assessment.
Get too far away, I've got
Yeah, but what why does one have to agree with either Carl Schmitt or Heidegger?
No, I'm just saying it's interesting.
It's interesting.
The Royal Institute of Philosophy, and also the Institute of Philosophy here, but I'm also attend look on reading group as well here. That's hard going. It's interesting. I should have No. He was saying about, I was saying just repeat what he said about democracy. I was thinking about this myself.
I was thinking more about Hegel when I leave here.
One of them is I heard Tony Benn said,
I was just wondering if...
Causing that so easily, the others are like governments. So I'm finding out and saying it right now.
Yes.
Don't I can kick him
Well,
out.
extremely small user group.
that's true.
There's a maximum of 8.
It doesn't mean to say that we couldn't improve on it.
Well, of course, we've got
Example,
who is
recall
a native Frenchman.
where you don't like
the original text. We're all reading translations.
source of, and this is another that's what I thought about.
Whenever there's a step,
People just don't like it. The recall
French version.
I think it's full of all sorts of dangers that.
They can psycho.
It depends what you see. What do you see?
Fluent German speaker. We've got
representatives.
Fluent Greek
It's
speaker.
a delegate.
What we consider we've only got 8 people.
My sister is a representative, not a delegate.
you got any idea how to
Although we have the practice one.
Yes. I read that.
you never see it come back.
You seem to read paper at the time. Because just to me, just it's a little bad patch. It says. Well, it's big society. God, I'm surprised. How big society is to get the world in a state. It's all it is. That's all it is. One of the ways, of course, go back to the 19th century.
I don't think more of the welfare state is defensive. And the reason I say that is because it was formed at a time when, under certain conditions, what should have happened was a proletarian revolution, and instead a soft was given, namely the welfare state.
Well, you would say that. You would say that.
But no,
I'm saying
that seems to be a very philosophers now.
I'm great to find
Because quite a few emphasize
normally the hospital
yes, but I'm for
he doesn't always do this. Makes me feel embarrassed. Thank you very much. Next time, just remember that. He embarrassed me. Thank you very much. That's very good.
But of course it isn't, it's friendship.
No. You know what? I've said this before, and I'll say it again. You are a friend. You are. I said that, I'm sure, I'm putting you on the scene. If I phoned you up and said,
I mean, this is what nature.
Is that right?
Come to terms with that quantum theory, and you could put it out even
I hope you don't have to. I hope you don't say that.
And the
your real friends are. Anyway, thank you for the coffee. I remember you saying, that's all right, that's okay. I remember you saying to me,
which is the one mind, but what is the it's very important. What is the purpose of culture? It's true. Real friendship is very important for all aspect of life. What is that? Was one of the big names for each other is very perfect.
big name for us.
Science study to Buddhism because both sides of the sky is another form of matter which they discovered everything the individual particles completely unique identity. So one thinks that it can just yes, and it's again other changes and without any
I misunderstood you. Yes, I see what you mean. That's interesting thought. I misunderstood you. I don't know what I thought you were saying, but I didn't understand that.
I think we're only waiting for one person, so I'll just make one or two preliminary remarks. And that is, if anybody wants the text, I'm happy, from which I've read today, I'm happy to give it to you if you email me, on one condition, that you don't send it to anybody else without at least asking me first, or quote from it. Until I've published it, and then I can be hung by
presumably it's a part of the chapter.
well, yeah, I mean, it's not part of the chapter. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do with this material. The other point I'm going to make is that, you know, I'm sure I'm guilty of this as anybody else, but Hegel is very susceptible of being traduced by his interpreters. You know, I've become very interested in the backdrop of this notion of Sophocles' Antigone, because it's such an important play for Schelling and for Hegel, and above all for Helden, who after all produced a translation of it, which Hegel quotes from. And it was the rejection, or arguably, among other things, but it was the rejection of Hölderlin's translation of Antigone by Voss that was one of the things that precipitated Hölderlin's descent into madness. Nevertheless, I've read a number of articles and books now which aggressively talk about Hegel's Antigone interpretation. You'd be, if anyone can find it for me, I'll pay you £1,000. It doesn't exist. There are scattered remarks about Antigone throughout Hegel, and there are about 8 or 9 pages in the Phänomenologie which are making points that there are one or two references to Antigone that illuminate the points, but there is no formal interpretation of Antigone anywhere to be found in Hegel. And one person in particular, I won't name her, but she's a feminist commentator on Hegel, trashes Hegel for his Antigone interpretation and quotes with enthusiasm an article which brings together all the main quotes, but that I've also read. The article, the main thrust of the article's point is to argue that there is no single interpretation of Antigone in Hegel's text. And it's a shame. But you know, this seems to happen to Hegel a lot, and partly because he's so difficult, and therefore you can normally wring anything out of him and get away with it, because the work of disproving what you've said is so hard that. But it's worth and yet I think there is something very, very important going on in Hegel's interpretation, or his reference to Hölderlin and Hölderlin's interpretation, and in his use of Antigone in this relationship of the family to the state.
And what is your recommended English text for Hegel of the 3 you mentioned? Is there one?
Of the Logik?
Yeah.
Oh, well, no, I mean, there are 3 different editions of Hegel's Logik in German.
Oh, right.
There's a very, very good Cambridge, in the new Cambridge translations of Hegel series. The translation of the Logik of 1816 is a very fine translation, it seems to me. It's certainly one of the ones.
I
can't remember.
Is this the one on the back of the...
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Yeah.
That's
so I put a few texts.
By George Di Giovanni, is that?
That's it. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. You could download it from Gigapedia until quite recently. I did buy the book, but Gigapedia is gone. We should start. The way I propose to do this is simply just to throw it to open form, and we'll go through it paragraph by paragraph. There's one observation I would like to make. In this first paragraph, you will notice this verb, sich selbst bewähren. If you know your Karl Marx well, you'll know that Marx uses this verb when quoting Hegel to say that the essence of man, he says, the essence of man, das Wesen des Menschen, das sich bewährende Wesen, ist Arbeit. Now, that's in the Parisian manuscripts. And we know that Marx was reading the Logik immediately before he wrote the Parisian manuscripts. And if you ever wanted one of the key connections between Marx and Hegel, it's one of the reasons why I chose this passage. Actually, a lot of people trace Marx's use of the term Gattungswesen to Feuerbach. I don't really think it is. I think he uses Feuerbach's term, but he's using it in an entirely Hegelian way. I mean, he's modifying it for his own thought, but it's Hegel he has in mind, not Feuerbach, when he uses this term Gattungswesen.
Could you just point out on the text where that
comes up? It's page 484 in the first paragraph. ist eine Voraussetzung, die noch nicht durch sich selbst bewährt ist.
I was going to ask a quick, quick clarification now. When you said that very important one about the relationship of necessity to freedom, which both Kant and Hegel could not resolve, what exactly is the context of the two words when you use necessity and freedom? Because at the moment it just stands on its own as two words. But can you contextualize it?
No, Kant was not fully able to resolve the relationship of necessity and freedom, and he comments on that in the Opus Posthumum in particular. His failure to be able to bring into relation, he says, God, the world, and man, is also his failure to be able to think through the relationship between freedom and necessity. Hegel thinks he has resolved this question. And so the opening sections of the Naturphilosophie concentrate on the notion of contingency and necessity, where he's essentially rubbing out the notion of contingency. But at the back of this is because he's out after what freedom is. And so the question of freedom, which is, he doesn't fully clarify in the Naturphilosophie, but the question of freedom is being discussed all the way through the opening to the Naturphilosophie. But the question of freedom is the question of the freedom of absolute subjectivity to be itself. However, this, for Hegel, is a positive freedom. And that's why for him, Recht, law, or right, is a positive freedom, as opposed to Rousseau's understanding of freedom as negative freedom. If you want to caricature, your freedom begins when mine ends, as French intellectuals will often tell you. Hegel says, oh no, we're both going to be free together in the only way I know how. To caricature in the opposite direction.
So, Laurence, what does it mean to say that the living individual is a presupposition which has not yet proven itself? En vooruitzetting die nog niet door zichzelf beweerd is.
So we stand immediately before the notion of cognition, and therefore the living individual as a separate and separated entity. And I think that's what I think is the Abgeschieden refers to. We're up on the threshold of this, and so therefore this is a recapitulation. So the sich bewähren, that which will prove itself, is, as it were, is the individual as it will pass through what I referred to in the lecture as the steps, the Stufen of its existence.
That's right, but you said the steps of the nature, the stages of nature should not be understood as constructive. They are already there. But here, in this section, it seems that Hegel is trying to make a distinction between Wirklichkeit and Begriff, and to say that now we're not going to talk about how the individual is a presupposition for the Begriff, for the concept, in other sense for the judgment. To say SSP, I have to have a notion of an individual, but that's merely for Aussetzung. Now, individual is understood insofar as it actually produces itself. Mm-hmm. So insofar as we're not talking about individual as a Begriff, as a grasp, but as an idee, and that means as a reality. Is that correct? Or?
Yes, but we shouldn't step over the notion of negativity here. So that at each stage, the stage itself is the negative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the individual starts out as a negative,
The moment where I can say,
well, the individual experiences the stage in which it itself is as a negative. So it's stepping out from the negativity of itself towards something, rather than, so therefore the totality is always present for it, but it realizes the totality as the negative of the totality that it realizes.
Yeah. So the moment where I can say, I'm not all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the moment where I'm not all of you, I'm not all of this. That's where there is an individual which produces itself as its own. He says it als die Grundlage seiner selbst.
Yeah.
That's the foundation of itself. So that's it's a dynamic thing.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's a production, isn't it?
Yes. Well, it's going to enter into its production. So the production is the engaging in its engaging with its materialization. So this is the relationship between, as it were, the abstraction and the material.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is, if I'm correct, is very, you said that yourself, at the basis is a very Aristotelian notion of species.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. How does that relate to, we were just talking about this in the break, how does that relate in your view to the contemporary notion of species we have in biology, as we said, the evolutionary notion of species? Because you might say here, this setting itself as a foundation of itself is that which creates the distinction between the general and the particular, and that's how a species realizes itself through its individuals. That's also what happens in the genetic, in the passing on of the genes, but the genes can mutate, and that's why there are different species. Here, that has to be very different. Aristotelian story of the essential differences that arise out of the nature of the process of realization, the nature of nature itself. Do you see? Is that a relevant question, or is Darwin talking about something else than what Hegel is talking about?
That's not something I've immediately thought about. I mean, I think it's worth thinking through. Yeah. Would you want to comment on it? As I said, this is an open discussion.
Yes, I want to comment on it in that sense, and I would like to say, to put it bluntly, that with a Darwinian view of nature, which is a statistical view of nature, there is absolutely no possibility anymore for a Hegelian view of nature. That is no longer, it's no longer in the age of understanding nature as a process of information transmission through genetic structures. There is no possibility for an Aristotelian concept of the Gattung anymore. And so the whole question of, so you say in the end production, reproduction is understood as production. Yeah, whereas almost in the Darwinian view of nature, it's almost the other way around. Production is reproduction, but every reproduction is never is not a reproduction of the same, but because it is statistical and contingent, it includes the possibility of something else. And so this whole relation of nature as a mechanism of survival, really, the perspective of nature as something, as a system that survives through adaptation, is something that seems to run counter to the question is how could that be reconciled, if at all, with the view of the Gattung, nature as it comes forward from this. And this is an important question so far as the reception of Hegel is concerned, because from the point of view of, let's say, the Schmidt-Heidegger discussion, with Heidegger has no problems to accept Darwin. I mean, he would accept that is what nature is. That is nature in the form of nature as, and what we call nature for Heidegger would be Gestell. technology, and technology is that kind of reduction.
He's quite a vigorous critic of theories of biology, of contemporary theories of biology.
Because they.
Yeah, and so I mean, I'm just trying to recall his own debates around von Exkel and the sort of the much more idealist understanding of biology that von Exkel was advocating. I wouldn't want I can't remember Heidegger ever commenting on Darwin. I wouldn't want to go there because I don't think that's right. I don't think he would particularly opt for Darwin. I mean, the question I was formulating for you in response to this is what Hegel's point here is the place of thought. Is that Darwin is not yet able, even with a statistical understanding of species, is not yet able to realize that by identifying what the specificity of thinking as a human activity. And it's from out of there. Is that quote that I heard earlier? That whatever is human is realized only in thought.
But you could. Yeah.
I wonder what you're driving at. In other words, I wonder what I see your point, but
I'm driving at as well. I think one thing that you said was that there is. You said this, Hegel, so for Heidegger, Hegel becomes a totalitarian thinker.
Well, there's a tendency towards totalitarianism in the reception of Hegel, which is slightly different.
And what I got from some things you said, but maybe I wasn't right in that, but what I got from it was that you were trying to move towards the point of saying, actually what Hegel is talking about here is Arbeit. Is so, and to say that really to repeat the Heideggerian critique of metaphysics as ending in this notion of Arbeit or productivity, or the subjectivity affirming itself, and that you were trying to say that that's already present here. You see it emerging here, and then in Marx it just comes to the fore.
I think both of those are interpretations. I mean, I think, I'd want to stress that what I'd like to look at later on is Hegel's notion of the appetitus, the Begierde, which I think Marx interprets as will, and so does Heidegger.
Yeah.
So that Arbeit is will, as Heidegger at one point says in an interpretation of Hegel. And I think Marx is coming very close to that as well. Hegel himself never actually says that, as far as I can tell. But he does think that there is something in the living of living itself, which is, as it were, appetitive.
Yeah.
And there I think there's a connection with Spinoza, with Spinoza's notion of the I'm trying to think of the Latin word that Spinoza uses. Conatus, that's right, the conatus of life itself.
And he says it here, das Lebendige ist zu Typ.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, now maybe it'll come, what I wanted to say will come back later on, but maybe we should focus on this passage to understand what cartoon means. So going back to my question, then other people say something. What I said, the most important thing was to say that here, if I understand it correctly, the individual is understood as far as it produces itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the key point here is that the individual now, the English has, the individual now brings itself forth out of actuality. Nun aus der Wirklichkeit sich hervorbringt.
Yeah.
But here we have to hear a very active use of the vehicle.
Which stands in opposition to Begriff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet it's the opposition to Begriff is precisely the opposition as negation. But negation almost in the photographic sense of a negative image. Yeah.
Sorry, can you say that again? Begriff is a negative of Wirklichkeit?
No, the Wirklichkeit is a negative of the Begriff.
And definitely not the other way around.
And definitely not the other way around. Because to a certain extent, the Begriff is itself self-sufficient. There is a sense in which, I mean, much more so in Aristotle than in Hegel, the Begriff is unchanging. I mean, it's unchanging in Hegel because, strictly speaking, it's contentless. Whereas for Aristotle, it's not contentless. But
okay, and on page 486, if we can run ahead a little bit, he says, in relation to this, der Keim ist so das ganze Lebendige in der innerlichen Form des Begriffes. So the Keim, what is that in English? The germ, yeah. The germ is the whole living thing in the inner form of the concept, or of the Begriffes.
yeah.
It seems to me that he's sort of playing with this distinction between the real, the material, and the conceptual.
Is it a play?
You know, it's not a play.
That's
because here you might say, that's very Aristotelian to say that that's, if you understand Begriff as that which conceives together that which something is. Maybe that's why I thought of the genetic blueprint, because that's almost like the DNA code or something like that, which is lodged in the germ, and from which the whole thing grows up to natural, whatever it is, the well. But how do you move from that to Geist, which is, it seems to me that in this section he's trying to perform that very strange move that shows how both the principle, both what nature is as Gattung and Geist are the same thing.
Yeah. Here, though, well, we are considering Geist as it were, as process itself, as movement, therefore, Bewegung and Prozess, not, therefore, simply as stuff, or in our own inability to relate it to stuff. So the modern notion of matter is stuff, but if you want to, what I had in mind when in coming to this, you take the sort of debates that follow on after Foucault. You get this extensively in Judith Butler, of the attempt to show how materialization is a discursive, what she calls a function of the discursive. There's a strong sense in which she can only say that because Hegel has thought in this way. And yet she's saying the opposite of Hegel. She's saying that we materialize things through discourse. Whereas, but it's as it were the post-Foucauldian or post-structuralist quest is to find the connection between discourse and materiality. Now, Hegel is not anxious about that in the least. There is no anxiety in Hegel. It's simply the drive to explain it, to explain something, as it were, that he thinks we've been missing all along. And that's the extent to which materialization is organized rationally So if we take the term discourse and the rational to be interchangeable, which they're not for Foucault, but they're at least closely related. But Hegel thinks that this is simply a matter of we simply need to explain it. I mean, the problem for me with accounts like Judith Butler's is you can never hurt yourself. You can never be hit by anything because it's simply a matter of discourse. Your materiality is simply a matter of discourse. Well, except that you can. If a tree trunk falls on you, you're going to bruise, and that's not going to be. You may have some discourse about it, but
very short one.
But it's not realized discursively. The tree has come out and hit you.
And that's a kind of materialism. So if we mean that by materialism, then that there is something that doesn't have this permeability of thought, then where does that originate in this text? Because in this text,
one of the ways to interpret Hegel here is precisely because you could say that what Foucault and those who follow after him are doing is simply bringing to fruition something which Hegel has begun to intimate we are already aware, which is that we are no longer able to connect the discursive and the material. So this is the last and greatest gasp of the attempt to undertake that connection. Now that's much more, I think, like a Heideggerian interpretation. That, as it were, what is Hegel successful in this, or is he the last post before the onset of a kind of nihilism that is unable to reach the thing in itself?
and that would be because he says the living individual is the foundation of itself. Because as far as I can see, that's the only place where materiality comes in here.
No, because I mean that's the whole point of the logic. Because the logic is the whole reason why we are preoccupied with the logic is because we're preoccupied with the question of relation for helpness. So that the individual only emerges at the end of a logical process, a process of relation, even though it then is the pretext for the next unfolding of logic. But it's in the process that we also have to look for the meaning of the materialization. At the beginning of I think it's the third of the Jenaer sketches. It's the third. At the beginning of the third of the Jenaer sketches, he has a long section on the origin of reflection, where he again begins with the animal. The animal knows something, and like the animal, the human being fixes on an object, which it brings into its contemplation. But the truly human mood, and this is the reference that I made from the Logik, from the encyclopedia version of the Logik, is to understand that you're not fixing on the object, but fixing on the fixing. But as it were, before you can fix on the fixing, you have to fix on the object, which specifies your individuality. And it's only at that point you can then move beyond your individuality into production. Now, what is missing here, which Marx does supply, I think, in Spade works, which Hegel clearly also believes, is the way in which humanity is at the center of the meaning of the cosmos. You know, Marx doesn't work unless humanity, and he actually says that repeatedly in the Parisian manuscripts, humanity is the meaning of everything that is. But Hegel also believes that. Now that's where I think, going back to your question about Darwin, where we are in a much more difficult place in the contemporary mind. There is much greater anxiety about whether or not humanity is the meaning of all things. But at the same time, and that's why I chose the passage, this passage about the Bemeisterung, the taking into mastery of everything, is exactly how we've now responded to humanity's anxious place in the midst of all things.
I have a problem with one expression, negative Einheit seines Andersseins. So it is different from something, and what is it different from? And it's negative, so what would be positive? I'm not really struggling with this expression.
Can you just remind me exactly where
That's the first paragraph, where it says, durch den Prozess hat es sich selbst gesetzt für sich als die negative Einheit seines Andersseins. It is different from something. What is that? What is the other that is different from? And why is it negative? Or what would be the positive? And why is it Einheit? So is there something implied that you could not have Einheit?
So the individual discovers its individual. The individual is itself for itself, but is able to reflect on the fact that it is itself for itself only by coming into relation with something else, where it discovers that it is itself for itself in relation to another. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it's just.
So,
what is the Anderssein?
The Anderssein is anything else that it comes up against. Well, so Hegel wants to say that the whole of nature, as it were, stands over against the individual and its individuality in that sense. Both every specific determination of something in nature and the otherness of otherness itself. So from any particular which stands over against me, I discover that there is otherness. And so Andersseins is the absolute generalization of otherness that every particular otherness brings before me, which I therefore experience as a negation. Does that make sense?
A negation of what?
Myself.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that having reached that stage, as it were, the next stage is to discover my interiority. Rather than, this is this question of Bemeisterung, rather than taking everything that is other than me over and trying to command it, I then realize that I myself stand within the otherness that everything other to me also stands within. So the positivity that you're seeking out is the negation of the initial negation. So the first negation is I discover there's something other to me. But then there is a further negation of that, which is that I discover that I am the same as everything, in some sense, as everything that is other to me.
Is this the same as identity and non-identity?
Yes. Yeah. So that even positivity is as it were, reached by a continual overcoming of the previous negativity. Does that make sense? So that's why it's logical, and that's why it proceeds in stages. But in each stage, something about the totality in question is given. Because at every stage, when I'm individual to myself, I experience that unreflectively as a unity, an Einheit. In discovering that there is otherness to me, that stands against me as an Einheit to my Einheit, which is the first moment of reflection. I then need to discover that this unity which stands over against me is part of the unity within which I stand. You see at each stage here, the notion of unity, Einheit, prevails and persists. It takes me through. And that's why this is a logic, rather than anything else. But there is a point where I then step beyond that to reproduce myself within this totality, just the moment of production. What Hegel's interested in is both that as a logical form, but the actual material realizations of that logical form, which he's then going to discuss in terms of marriage, the family, possessions, and the state. And there you have the interweaving of a pure logic with its material effects. What Marx would call social relations. Each of these presupposes sets of social relations.
Could we just go back for a moment to what was being discussed about Darwin? Surely the way Darwin approaches this problem is totally different from Hegel. And this idea of humanity being at the centre of the cosmos, Darwin would never agree with that.
I'd be anxious about what Darwin would or wouldn't agree with, partly because I don't know Darwin's text very well, but also because Darwin is doing something completely different.
Well, yes, exactly, that's what I meant.
I mean, Darwin is not attempting to be a philosopher in this way.
Yes.
Why I'm slightly anxious about this is because although I can't believe that Hegel was familiar with Darwin as such, Hegel would have been familiar with the ideas with which Darwin himself was familiar. And that's why I don't want to press this into an opposition that I don't know about. Because the whole point about the Naturphilosophie is that and why we've looked at the preface to it, is because it's Hegel believes that any logic, any philosophical logic, has to stand in a positive relation to science. That's why the second volume of the encyclopedia was written. And so therefore, and that's in a sense what Johann is trying to do. He's trying to sort of find the killer move that kills Hegel, as it were, that suggests that science is ahead of philosophy. It would be neat to do that in a small seminar in a room now, but I think if we went back and looked with care, this wouldn't be such an easy move to make. I'm not such an expert in the 19th century, therefore, that I can easily refute Johann. My suspicion, however, is that it's not as straightforward as it looks.
But following on from his point, I think I also take the same point that to Darwin, that humanity has been a complete accident among the galaxies and the stars and all that. It came about, it was a complete accident, and then it would seem, so to speak, almost the word absurd to posit anything center to itself.
Well, that's why I'd like an expert in the 19th century here, because I've heard people say the opposite about Darwin. I've heard, well, again, one must never force people to say things that they themselves will not willing to say. And I don't think Darwin does, to my very limited knowledge, I'm not sure that I recall Darwin ever speculating.
He didn't speculate, but
that's right.
He did action is this.
Well, that's an inference for us to make. I wonder, because I think Darwin is operating within certain intellectual constraints that are not present for us when we come to think about Darwin. So I just want to tread cautiously.
Yeah, I should probably brought it up, but when you're talking about Gattung, that's a word that almost necessitates that sort of connection. Logically speaking, if you read so we've read the first paragraph now. Can it be a plurality of Gattungen, or is there only one Gattung as the process of becoming general of the individual? So, could you also write a logic for cats that would be different from the logic of humans?
I think the answer is no. That this is Gattung as such.
As such, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, not Gattung. So each specific Gattung finds its home under this.
Is that the case? Could you, because right in the first paragraph it seems to it introduces Gattung as a Reflexionskategorie, as a reflex, where you would say catness, the catness that the cat realizes is not a category of reflection.
But that's exactly why therefore I took us to the Naturphilosophie and to the third of the Jenaer Systementwürfe, because that's where he asks that question. What is the relationship between the animal and the human? And that's why, what Hegel is therefore categorically saying, that some contemporary philosophers will want to deny, is that the animal knows something, but it doesn't know that it knows something.
Yeah, so the animal is, properly speaking, not a Gattung. Not in the
the animal is a Gattung for humanity. But that's precisely why humanity is at the centre of understanding. Because the animal, and that's why the animal never proceeds beyond the level of individuality for itself.
Yeah.
Even when it reproduces, it does so only instinctively. And that's why humanity, as an effect of reason, and that's why I quoted that sentence from the Habilitationsschrift, because humanity there is an effect of reason, not a cause. Because that's the contrary that I would want to pose to you, that something like what you delineated as Darwin's understanding of biology is only possible for a species, the human species, that regards reason as being in its own hands. Now, that's perhaps a good time to bring in Antigone, because the interpretation or the references to Antigone that Hegel does make in the Phänomenology are very clearly to argue that Antigone is to a certain extent vindicated, not because, not because she breaks the law, but rather because, having broken the law, she then undergoes a means by which she discovers herself internal to the law. That is to say, she discovers that the law is not hers to break. And what I mean by that is that she undergoes a process for Hegel, it seems to me, that where she, having understood herself as in some sense exterior, and so all the feminist critics get very excited about this, because Hegel refers to her as the irony of the polis. She's something external to it. But in fact, of course, what Hegel is trying to point to is that she moves from being the irony of the polis to discovering her interiority to the polis. She moves from the outside, where she begins, as the outcast, the one who's broken the law, to understanding what it means to have done so. And that from that she moves into the interior. And this is all to do with Sittlichkeit, with ethicality, if you like. Hegel's point, therefore, is that she discovers that the laws are not merely in her own hands, but rather she is an effect of the laws. In other words, Hegel is raising the question, exactly raising the question of whether or not the world is simply, even as we are at the centre of it, whether the world is simply at our hands to play with. And he's very decisive that it's not. We only attain to freedom when we realise, when we pass through the interiority of the world as it is. We don't attain to freedom by simply playing with it or having them at our disposal.
And that's what he means by freedom, is the recognition of necessity.
Yes, absolutely.
When we said that the world as it is, what do you mean, nature, the world as a nature, or the world or the nature shaped by reason? What is this world as it is?
Well, so that quotation that I gave from the Habilitationsschrift, which says that the material is an effect of the rational. It's the world, therefore, the world is organised by reason, rather than we deduce what reason is from off the world.
I have a question. Does Hegel regards reason as a later development of nature? So it does it. That means that reason as a later development of nature would be a self-affirmation of the nature under another shape or under another content, but it's the same development of nature.
Isn't this the same as Johann's question, which is, can you have evolution for Hegel? The answer must be yes, because Hegel's so concerned, even though he only understands evolution in anthropological terms, because he wants to explain progress. And he explains progress, therefore, by progress. Progress is the realization of the same, as it were. So that reason, in one particular section of the Phenomenology, he makes the point that every moment is eternal. This is not an unremarkable point. You could find Thomas Aquinas making the same point. You know, that every moment, this is how Aquinas resolves the understanding of the mentality of God as a single act. That whereas for humanity there is progression in time, the whole of time is present to the mind of God as a single moment. Now Hegel is inverting that, totally inverting it, because I don't think Hegel wants to talk about the mind of God in the same way that Aquinas does. But he does think that every moment, no matter where it is in the progression, indicates the totality in some particular way. So that from the interiority of the world, there can be something like progression. But understood absolutely, as he then says, every moment is eternal, i.e. every moment is also the same. Now Nietzsche stands that on its head yet again. That's what Nietzsche means by the eternal recurrence. Every moment is the same as every other, but at the same time every moment has no meaning. So whereas for Hegel every moment has absolute meaning, Nietzsche is almost taunting Hegel by saying that the eternal recurrence means that if every moment has absolute meaning, then meaning has no, that there is nothing like meaning.
Does Hegel ever make a distinction between human beings and rational agents? Because I have in mind really Kant here. I mean, Kant's first critique, humanity is at the centre, the Copernican shift. But then in the second critique, in practical reason, he has no reason to distinguish between human beings and rational agents. because his faith in the universality and objectivity of reason is so strong that anything he says about reason has to apply to any rational agent as such. And you were connecting thinking with humanity as such, but I just wondered, I mean, does Hegel ever look into that distinction that Kant has to make between the theoretical and the practical?
I mean, the answer must be yes, but I can't do it off the top of my head. But I just wonder what distinction you make between a rational agent and a human being.
Well, it's a completely speculative distinction because we don't know any other rational agents.
It's not a speculative question in the tradition. I mean, again, to quote Aquinas, for Aquinas there are other rational agents, and that's the angels. And there are all those peculiar questions on the angels in the last half of the De Veritate. Where that comes from, I just don't know. I think already for Hegel, there is nothing like an angel.
Yeah, I mean, Hegel pays a lot more attention to the idea of embodiment and the body than Kant does. So Hegel would want to say that there's been a kind of intellectualizing in Kant, which has taken us away from the reality of what it is to be a human being.
I think that's part of Hegel's relentless materialism. That angels belong to the Kantian Übersinnliche, the supersensible. Hegel is an implacable enemy of the supersensible.
There's also the other side, of course, that not all human beings are at all times rational agents. So
Hegel agreed with that. So
I mean, there's on one side the question: are there other rational agents than humans? On the other side, there is a more suspicious question: are all human beings rational agents?
Well, where would Hegel stand in that?
Yeah,
he wants to say that every human being has the potential to be a rational agent.
Yeah. But again, that means that Gattung, where I understand it here, is the Gattung that we're talking about here is the species human, in which, in German you could say so-and-so is a real Mensch, which is also something else than the biological thing. It's almost as if this is the Gattung of the rational agent rather than of this teeming life that constitutes that aspect of humanity. I had to think of the angels as well, because of course with the definition of the angels, this question of Gattung is also essential. The species that for Aquinas, the angel is the entity, rational entity, which has no distinction between the species and the individual. I think, if I remember correctly, so an angel is its own species. And so in that sense, although there are no angels for Hegel, this is you could read this as the angelification of human beings.
You could. I mean, if I could just take you to page 485, which is page 687 in the English. Just this touches on Miroslav's question. Die Identität mit dem anderen, die Allgemeinheit des Individuums, ist somit nur erst innerliche oder subjektive. Then it's not an opposition. That's inward as subjective. Es hat daher das Verlangen, dieselbe zu setzen und sich als Allgemeines zu realisieren. Dieser Trieb der Gattung. This leads up to this sentence that Johann drew our attention to. Der Kern, the germ, ist so das ganze Lebendige in der innerlichen Form des Begriffes. So it's there is a sense in which this whole section, again, expresses something, or repeats something, which is entirely Aristotelian in its form. In the Historia Animalium, I think it is, Aristotle asks about the meaning of sexual reproduction, and says that every living being imitates eternity in the manner or in the character that it's capable of. There is a sense in which Hegel is not saying anything different.
Aristotle, that's connected to reproduction.
It is. I mean, Aristotle, in some sense, he wants to. Now, what is significant, and I think is especially significant for me as a reader of Hegel, is that Aristotle sets reproduction in human life to one side. He simply wants to account for it. But it's not the place where he derives the meaning of human being. And this is something this is simply what I'm drawing to a close now. This is why I think Hegel's understanding of the family is so important. Because Aristotle wants to distinguish between the human being as something which reproduces and the human being as something which is. Hegel conflates those two. And he does so partly because of what Heidegger calls the Christianization of philosophy. He wants to limit philosophy to some very specific historical concerns. So whereas for both Aristotle and Plato, meaning is derived out of from entirely other places, Hegel focuses on reproduction as the origin of all social relations. That's something that I want us to come back to over the coming weeks, because it's quite important that the way that Hegel is, as it were, Hegel is driving this far, far beyond anything that Aristotle ever said.
I can see why feminists don't like it.
What?
I can see why feminists don't like it very much.
Absolutely, and I think that it's a major problem. I don't think you can get around it, and that's where I have a lot more sympathy with the feminist reading of Hegel, to be honest. One of the reasons why I find Hegel myself so troubling. But we'll come on to that in future weeks. It's gone 1:30, so I'd like to thank everybody very much. Thank you very much.